Welcome to Preeminent Test Prep. Today is day 67 in the 90-day SAT Prep series. Today I'll be doing a compilation of SAT math tricks along with SAT writing tips. So the SAT math tips and tricks are going to apply to both the math no calculator section as well as the math with calculator section, and then the SAT writing tips and tricks will obviously be particular to the SAT writing section. So these tips and tricks are designed to teach you what to look for on the SAT as far as how to be more efficient as well as how to get to the correct answer. Basically trying to teach you what I look for on the SAT as someone who has scored 1590, what I do to save time in certain areas and identify the correct answer and not be misled by anything that could be construed as potentially being a correct answer, and helping you immediately identify things that are wrong answers and immediately identify things that are correct. So hopefully this video will help you do that. If you have a notebook out, that would probably be helpful to take notes on these tips and tricks you can use to save time and find the correct answer as fast as possible. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the math tips and tricks, and then after right around 10, 15, or 20 minutes or 25 minutes, we'll switch over to the SAT writing tips and tricks. I have an SAT math trick that I want to show you. So I'm going to use question 12 from SAT practice test 8 as an example to show and illustrate this tip and trick. So in this case, if I read this question, I see I have if 2a over b equals 1/2, what's the value of b over a? Well, in this case, what I actually find is that inputting variables is going to help me find this pretty quick. So if I put in a 1 for a, then I'm going to have to put in a 4 for b, right? Because 2 over 4 is equal to 1/2. So at that point, then I know that a is equal to 1, and I know that b is equal to 4. 4 over 1 then is going to equal 4, and my correct answer is going to be D. So in this case, instituting or inputting variables is really easy here and makes the problem much faster to solve. You notice I solved that one in like 10 seconds or so. So that's a strategy that you can use if you see that you have a ratio like 1/2 and a simple number like 2. You notice right away that 1/2 is going to equal 2 over 4. Plug in a 1 for A, plug in a 4 for B, and then at that point you just go and plug them in over here as well. So that's a tip you can use to save time on the SAT math section. It's something I'd highly recommend doing. Today I have an SAT math tip and trick that I want to share with you. So this deals with question 10 from SAT practice test 8, the math with calculator section. So this question doesn't really have anything to do with having a calculator versus not having a calculator. This is just something I want to show you where you can use intuition and common sense to help you get to the correct answer in certain scenarios in the SAT math section. So in this case, I want to show you question 10. Okay, so we're going to focus on this. Now, this is a paired question, so questions 9 through 11 are dealing with this situation represented right here. So I'll just give you a quick overview of the situation, then we'll get into question 10, and I'll show you how this tip applies. So obviously we have, looks like a cup here. Okay, it says it's a glass. Picture above can hold a maximum volume of 473 cubic centimeters, which is about 16 fluid ounces. Right, and we're given an equation for volume, but obviously just by looking at this cup, we see that we are going away from that base, right? So we see that our circumference is getting larger as we move up in this cup. Okay, so my question 10 says water pours into the glass slowly and at a constant rate. Okay, so that means that our volume, right, the volume of the water we're putting in, let's say that it's 5 milliliters per second. Okay, that's constant. So which of the following graphs best illustrates the height of the water glass or the water level in the glass as it fills? Okay, so let's just think about it. Let's just draw, we'll just draw like a little hose with water going into this this cup. So as water is going in, obviously we think that it's going to fill very quickly down low, right? Because it can't go out as wide. But as we get higher, we see that this cup goes wider. Okay, so that height that it's filling, it's going to slow. Okay, so the height's going to rise really quick at first because it doesn't have anywhere to go sideways. But then as it gets higher, it can move more horizontally, right? It gets larger of a surface going across that cup that it can cover. So then we know as we pour more water into it, and you know this from your experience filling cups with water and liquids, that as you go up that water level, that height, it's not going to increase as quickly at those higher levels. Okay, so we know it's not going to be a slope that's constant. We know it's going to have to be a changing slope. Okay, now the other thing that we know, obviously D is incorrect because that shows that the height doesn't change. And then between B and C, we know that the answer is going to be C because that water level height is going to increase quickly at first, where that cup is small at the bottom. But then, as it increases, okay, we see we have more room to go horizontally that we have to cover with water. So thus that height is going to lower its slope, right? It's going to change less and less as time goes on. So our answer there would be C. Okay, so that's a way that you can use your intuition and your common sense to answer questions on the SAT math section. So don't always think that you have to use an equation to solve. Okay, in some cases, not all, but in some cases, you can use intuition and common sense to get to a correct answer really quickly. Okay, so if you saw the scenario, you would think obviously that cup is getting wider as it goes up, therefore the height is going to change at a slower rate as we fill it with water. Okay, so our answer there would be C. So that's just one example of how you can use common sense and intuition to find the correct answer on the SAT math section. So not everything has to do with an equation. So as always, hopefully that was helpful. Today I have an SAT math tip and trick that I want to share with you that deals with determining the number of solutions in a system of equations. So if you look at question 14, I'm going to use question 14 to illustrate this tip and trick. So if we look at this, we obviously have two different equations, right? We have y equals x squared plus 3x minus 7. We have y minus 5x plus 8 equals 0. So whereas how many solutions there are to the system of equations above. So in order to solve for that, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to set this bottom equation, which I'm going to star right here, of y minus 5x plus 8. I want to get what y equals so that I can substitute in for y in this top equation in order to get one equation. So I'm going to go ahead and add 5x and subtract 8 from each side here. So add 5x and subtract 8. So now I have y equals 5x minus 8. Okay, so I can go ahead and plug that in up top, 5x minus 8. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add 8 to each side because I want to set it equal to 0. So I'll add 8 to each side, and I will subtract 5x from each side. Okay, so I'll subtract 5x from each side as well. So 3x minus 5x will give me negative 2x. So I'm left with x squared minus 2x, and then negative 7 plus 8 will leave me with plus 1. So that right there will equal y. Okay, so at this point, what I'm going to do now that I have this equation set up, and obviously that's going to equal 0, okay, since I got rid of all my terms on that right side there, so that's going to equal 0. So what I can do at this point is I can use b squared minus 4ac to determine the number of solutions. Okay, so in determining the number of solutions, if b squared minus 4ac is greater than 0, then there are going to be 2 real solutions. So then there will be 2 real solutions. Now if b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, b squared minus 4ac, let's say that it's equal to 0. In that case, there will be 1 real solution. Now what if b squared minus 4ac is less than 0? Well, if it's less than 0, then there are no real solutions. Okay, so that would be 0 real solutions. Okay, so let's go ahead and determine that using our equation up here. So we know our a value is going to be our coefficient in front of our x squared term. We know our b value is going to be our coefficient in front of our x term. So in that case, our b is negative 2. And we know our c term is going to be 1 here because our c term is whatever our term is here, where I'm underlining. So that'll be 1. Okay, so we know a is equal to 1. We know b is equal to negative 2. And we know our c is equal to 1. So at that point, we go ahead and plug it into b squared minus 4ac. So b is negative 2. So we take negative 2, we square that. We subtract 4 times a, which is 1, and then times c, which is also 1. Okay, we know that negative 2 squared is going to give us 4, and then we have 4 minus 4 times 1, which is 4 minus 4, which will leave us at 0. Okay, so since b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, we know then that there's going to be exactly 1 solution, so our answer there will be C. So hopefully this video was helpful. This is a really good, important thing to know for the SAT math section, because if you don't know that, then you got to go through and do a bunch of other steps. So knowing this is definitely crucial to the SAT math section in my opinion. So hopefully this was helpful. Today I have an SAT math tip and trick for you that deals with setting up ratios. So the way that you set up a ratio can really help you save time if you know how to set it up correctly. So for this example, for this tip, I'm going to go ahead and illustrate it through question 3 from SAT practice test 8, the math with calculator section. So in a random sample of 200 cars of a particular model, 3 have a manufacturing defect. At this rate, how many of 10,000 cars of the same model will have a manufacturing defect? Okay, we know that 3 out of 200 cars have a manufacturing defect in the sample. We know that we're told it's at the same rate. So we want to know how many out of 10,000 then will have that defect. Okay, so that what you'll notice right here is that I put my variable I want to solve for, x, which is the number of cars that will have a manufacturing defect out of 10,000, on top. Now, why did I put that on top? So obviously I put my 3 on top over here, but I could have just as well done 200 over 3 equals 10,000 over x. So why did I choose to set it up like this, right? With that 3 over 200 equals x over 10,000. Well, here's why. Because it's going to save me steps and help me get to my correct answer faster. Because when I multiply that on each side by 10,000, I'm left with x. So we notice that all I had to do is multiply each side by 10,000 to get my answer. Because now I have 3 times 10,000 over 200. I plug that in my calculator, and that's going to give me 150. So I know that x then has to equal 150, so my answer will be A. Okay, so why does setting it up like this with the variable that I want to solve for on top save me time? Well, I'll go ahead and show you. If I was to set it up with the variable I want to solve for on the bottom in my denominator, then I have to multiply each side by x. Okay, so that's one step. Then I have to multiply each side by 3. Okay, so now I've got 3 times 10,000. Then I got to divide each side by 200. So what you notice there is that there were 2 more steps at least in solving this problem, right? So look at how much more work that bottom one is versus just multiplying by the denominator that is below my numerator of x, okay? So look at how many more steps this bottom setup is versus the top. So that's why anytime you're setting up a ratio, you want the variable that you want to solve for to be in your numerator if it's possible. Because by doing that, you're going to save yourself time in steps, right? And the other thing is by doing less steps, you're less likely to make a mistake. So that makes it a lot more efficient, and it also makes it so you're more likely to get the correct answer because you're not doing as many steps that could lead to a mistake. So anytime that you're asked to solve for something dealing with ratios like this, try to put the variable that you want to solve for on top in your numerator, and that'll help you save time on the SAT math section. So as always, hopefully that was helpful. I have an SAT math trick that I want to show you. So this trick deals with lines of best fit on the math with calculator section. So to illustrate my tip, I'm going to use question 4 from SAT practice test 8, the math with calculator section. So we see here that we have length on our y-axis and width on our x-axis with a line of best fit as that line going through the middle of the graph. So we're told the scatter plot above shows data collected on the lengths and widths of iris setosa petals. A line of best fit for the data is also shown. Based on the line of best fit, if the width of an iris setosa petal is 19 millimeters, what is the predicted length in millimeters of the petal? Well, we see that 19 isn't on our width here. So we could estimate right around where 19 would be, right? And we draw a line up. And then we could connect that to our line of best fit and try to take a good guess. But if they had 2 answer choices that were really close, like in this case C and D are really close, what we'd want to do then is take this equation for the line of best fit and plug in for x, right? So say that you have bad vision or you can't really tell based on where 19 would be, but you want to be sure in your answer. Then you want to take that equation and then plug in for x, 19. So you do y equals 1.67 times 19. And then plus 21.1. So you plug that in your calculator, not the y, just the 1.67 times 19, and then plus 21.1. So I'll put that in my calculator right now, and that's going to give you 52.83. Okay, 52.83. So even if these two C and D were really close together, and you did this, you know you're going to end up with 52.83, so you know your answer would be C, right? So if this case, let's say that D was 53.27. Right, 53.27. You have to use this equation to make sure you're getting to the correct answer because you're not going to be able to eyeball that difference of right around a half by drawing that line up and going across like that from this graph. So you want to make sure that you're using this equation in that scenario. So hopefully that was helpful. I have an SAT math tip / trick for you. So this tip and trick deals with correctly identifying one variable in terms of other variables. So if I look at question 3 here, I'm going to use question 3 to illustrate this tip and trick. So anytime that I glance at my answer choices and I see that I have one variable set equal to a bunch of other variables, so in this case we have E, O, and M, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and solve for that variable using the equation I'm given. Okay, so I can actually skip reading all of this up here. So I'll go ahead and exit out because I don't actually have to read that. So I know I don't have to read that because I see I have one variable, P, equal to all the other variables. So I know that I'm going to be asked a question such as this. Which of the following correctly gives P in terms of E, O, and M? Now in order to find what P equals, I don't have to read anything in this box, right? So I exit out. I don't have to read any of that. If I read that, I'm wasting my time because all I have to do is solve for P. So to solve for P here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply each side by 6. Multiply each side by 6. Now I have 6E equals O plus 4M plus P. At that point, I subtract O from each side. I subtract 4M from each side, thus leaving me with P is equal to 6E. And then here, I'll write that bigger. P will equal 6E minus 0 and then minus 4M equals P, right? So my answer there would be A. Okay, so that saves you time because instead of reading this whole paragraph, you can quickly identify, I see that I have P equal to something in A through D. Therefore, I know I'm solving for P. I read my quick question at the end. It says to solve for P. So in that case, I multiply each side by 6, subtract O, and subtract 4M, thus giving me 6E minus O minus 4M. So my answer there will be A. So that's a trick you can use to save time because you're not going to have to read that full paragraph. In this paragraph, it's even a little bit smaller than some others. Some of them are even longer. Some of them might go all the way down to here. And if you're able to skip all of that by identifying that you just have to manipulate the variables, it'll save you a lot of time. And time is crucial on the SAT. So hopefully this tip was helpful. If it was, today I have an SAT math trick that I want to show you. So this SAT math trick deals with word problems that give you widths and lengths and then ask you things about perimeter and area and things like that with geometry. So let's go ahead and take you through question 5, and then as I take you through question 5, I'll kind of illustrate my tip. So my tip deals with writing out your equation as you read through the word problem. So you'll notice as I read through this word problem, I'm writing out my equations and the rules that I have to follow to solve it. So I'll go ahead and show you. So I have the width of a rectangular dance floor is W feet. The length of the floor is 6 feet longer than the width. So I know my length is equal to W plus 6. Okay, now I see which of the following expresses the perimeter in feet of the dance floor in terms of W. I know my perimeter is 2 times my length plus 2 times my width. So then I plug in L equals W plus 6, and I have 2 times W plus 6 plus 2W. Now I'm going to have 2W plus 12 plus 2W, which will give me 4W plus 12, thus my answer will be B. So one thing I want to point out here is that if you were to not write out your equation as you read through this, then you would read through it, you'd get to the end, you would see which of the following expresses the perimeter in feet of the dance floor in terms of W, and at that point you would have to go back and reread, and then after that you'd read this sentence, the length is 6 feet longer than its width, and you would have to write that equation then. So basically what this is doing is it's preventing you from having to go back and waste that time rereading the question because you write out the information that you need as you read through. So by doing that, you're saving yourself some time rereading. So that's the SAT math trick, and hopefully that is helpful. An SAT math tip and trick that you can use to save time on the SAT math section. So this tip deals with question 11 from SAT practice test 8. So I'll quick go through the question, and as I go through, I will illustrate to you how to apply this tip in order to save time and get to the correct answer very efficiently. So if we look at this question, obviously we're given a graph and we're asked which of the following could be the equation of the graph above. So this is a fairly common question on the SAT math section for the with calculator or the without calculator. It could show up on either section. So when I see this question, the first thing I want to look at in my answer choices is I see I have it going up at the end on my left side and also going up on the end on my right side. So my end limit behavior is both going up. So I know I have to have x to an even integer, right? It has to be an even number. So it could be x squared, it could be x to the fourth, but either way it's going to have to be an even number. Okay, so I look at these, I have option A, I see I have 1x, 2x, 3x's, they're getting multiplied, so that's going to give me something with x cubed, so I know that that has to be wrong because that's x to the power of an odd integer. I look at B, I see that that's going to give me x to the fourth since I have x squared times x and times x. Next up, I see that C has x times 1x and then times another x, so that will once again give me x cubed, so that has to be incorrect because x cubed would look something like that, right, or something where it doesn't have the two end behaviors going up. If it's even, they both have to go up. If it's odd, then it's not going to be that case. One will go up and one will go down if it's an odd integer that x is raised to. And then I look at D. D, I have x squared times x and times x, so once again that'll give me x to the fourth. So that is x to the power of an even integer, therefore that could also be my correct answer. The next thing then that I'm going to look at to get to my correct answer is where my roots are, right? Where are my zeros? I see I have a 0 here, a 0 here, and a 0 here. So let's just go ahead and take a look at 2. Okay, if I want 0, or if I want 2 as one of my zeros, I need to have x minus 2 in my equation. So I'll take a look, I see that I only have x minus 2 between B and D. I only have x minus 2 in answer choice B, thus B has to be my correct answer. Okay, so the tip here that you can use to save time, it's really twofold, or two parts to this trick. First part is looking at end behavior, right? If they're both going up, then we have to have x raised to an even integer. If one was going up and one was going down, then x would be raised to an odd integer. Okay, the other thing that we want to look at is our zero. So if we have a graph like this and we're looking at which equation represents it, we want to take a look at our zeros or our roots. So in this case, we had a root at -3, which means that we would want to have x plus 3 in some part of our equation. We had a root at 0 and we had a root at 2, right? So we want to make sure that we have this x minus 2 and this x plus 3, which we see we do in option B. Okay, so that's a tip you can use to identify the equations of graphs on the SAT math section. So hopefully that was helpful. Today I'll be giving you a tip/trick for the SAT writing section that I would think that you should really pay attention to because it's something that could really trip you up if you're not careful. So to illustrate the point that I'm going to make here, I'm going to use question 44 from SAT practice test 7 because this doesn't show up a lot, but it is something that could definitely trip you up if you're not careful. So what I want to do here is I want to show you this tip. I call it the trump card trick, right? Now, it's not dealing with anything with Donald Trump, but it's called the trump card trick because this kind of trumps everything else, right? So generally, if we're looking at which choice most effectively signals a comparison the writer is making between two groups of people mentioned, right? If we're looking to compare things, we generally would want to avoid using not unlike, right? Because we know that not unlike just means like. So we would probably want to avoid A is what we would be immediately thinking. But here's the problem. The problem is A is actually correct, right? And that may come off as surprising because you might be thinking, why would we say not unlike and not just say like? Well, the reason A has to be correct is because if we look at options B through D, let's take a look at them. They say unlike, not like, and different from. A is the only one that means similar, okay? So I'm calling this the trump SAT writing trick, or trump card SAT writing trick, because in this case we're talking about how the correct relationship trumps everything, okay? So the correct relationship trumps everything, okay? The correct relationship between two ideas is going to trump everything. Okay, so in this case, let's take a look. So you haven't obviously read this passage, and I'm not going to make you read the whole thing, so I'll just give you a quick summary. It talks about how people got caught up in the excitement of this news story on the radio about aliens, and people believed it, and then it talks about how the American public embraced the legend that a ton of people were believing it, when in reality, probably not that many people actually believed it. Okay, so in this case, the researchers are suggesting that similar, okay, so like, right, similar or like, the people who got caught up in the excitement of the story when reading about it in the newspaper, the American public also may have been willing to embrace the legend because of its appeal to the imagination, right? So the news story appealed to the imagination, and so did this legend of people believing it. Okay, so those two things are similar, and those people are similar. Okay, so we need something that shows that they're similar to express that correct relationship. Now, the only option that says that they are similar is not unlike. So, well, normally we would want to just say like, because saying not unlike, it just doesn't sound well. We wouldn't normally say it. A has to be correct because it's the only answer choice that shows that they are similar. B, C, and D all shows that they are different. Okay, so none of those can be correct. Our answer has to be A, even though when at first looking at it, you may think not unlike has to be wrong because it has not and un in it, right? Which reduce each other and just make the word like. So you can't just do that. You have to make sure that it's showing the correct relationship. So in a situation like this where you're showing the relationship between two ideas or two subjects, make sure it's the correct relationship because the correct relationship trumps everything. Okay, so hopefully this video is helpful. This one's really more of a word of a warning. As it is a tip and trick, but definitely it's a word of warning to make sure you're looking for that correct relationship between two things. Okay, correct relationships and identifying those are very important on the SAT writing section. So hopefully this video is helpful. I have two SAT writing tips and tricks for you that deal with antecedents and pronouns. So we're going to go ahead and get started. What it's going to deal with in this case are going to be questions 30 and 31. So I'll illustrate this tip and trick as I go through these two questions so you'll be able to see it in action. So tip 1 is going to deal with the antecedents. So we have the sentence here, ironically, the success of crowdfunding may weaken overall funding for the arts if people begin to feel that paying for the art loved by them is someone else's responsibility. So in this case, what jumps out to me immediately when I see 30 here is the word loved by them, or the phrase loved by them. Okay, obviously that's wordy and it's unnatural. Okay, we wouldn't say paying for the art loved by them. We would say paying for the art they love, right? Now, so if they is the correct pronoun here, then that would be our correct answer, right? And they is the correct pronoun. That is the correct pronoun we would want to use. So B is our correct answer here. But I want to quick touch on why C and D you can immediately figure out are wrong. Okay, so if we look at our sentence here, we have the word or the subject people, right? People begin to feel that paying for the art they love is someone else's responsibility. Now, people is plural, okay? Him or her is singular, and he or she is also singular. So I immediately know C and D have to be wrong. Then I'm left between A and B. Obviously, A is wordy and it's unnatural. We wouldn't say the art loved by them. We would say the art they love. So then we would know immediately B would be our answer. So when dealing with a question that deals with an antecedent like this, where you have to find the number of what you're referring to, what I recommend doing is going back through and finding that subject. So in this case, that subject was people. Therefore, we knew that we had to have the plural pronoun they. Okay, next up is 31. So 31, I'm just going to skip down to where it is, and I'm going to show you what I look for here. Okay, so one thing that I immediately see with 31, and I'll quick show you, is I see I have their, her, and its. Now, I know that those are pretty much all here testing me on pronouns. So if I see I have their, her, its, I'm assuming no change would obviously be another pronoun as well, which I see it is. I see it's are. Okay, so I know that this is testing me on my use of pronouns. Now, in order to determine which pronoun should be used, I have to find my antecedent once again. So what I'm going to look for is I'm going to look for my antecedent. So I'm going to start in my sentence by subverting the presumption that money used for her project is an altruistic donation. The playwright showed that her work, right? We know the playwright is female because it's her project and it's her work. Okay, so we want to maintain that parallel structure or that parallelism between it being her project and it being her work. Okay, it has monetary value to those who enjoy it. Okay, so our answer there is going to have to be the answer C. Okay, we want her there. Right, so we know our answer there is going to be C. Now, one thing I want to point out there for 31 as well is sometimes you'll have to go back to that sentence before the sentence you're on to find what that pronoun should be, to find that subject it's referring to find that antecedent. Now, most of the time it will be in that same sentence, but there are occasions where you have to go back to that previous sentence to kind of figure it out. Now, those occasions they can be rare on the SAT writing section. Most of the time it'll be in the same sentence, but it is there, which is why I want to show you that. Now, let's say that you're reading through, right, and then you get to 31 and you got stuck and you were like, I don't know where to look, right? Just go ahead and look back within the sentence. If you can't find a subject there, at that point, then go back to the sentence before. Now, if there's a case where you have, let's say that you had, I'll go ahead and go back up to 31. Let's say that you had her, its, we'll say his, right, and then you had option B was something that wasn't a pronoun. It was something specific. And you're going through and you're looking, and keep in mind, I'm not talking about 31 anymore. That answer is C. I'm just talking in general. And you're looking through and you can't find what it's talking about, right? You can't find a pronoun. You can't find a clear subject. And one of your options is a clear subject, and there's nothing else. For example, say that using any pronoun would make it you don't know who it's referencing. Say that there were two people and an option, let's say that they were both female, and the option was her, and you don't know which one it's referring to. And another option is one of the names. You'd want to pick one of the names because you want to make sure it's clear who it's referring to. So in that case, you want to make sure it's clear who you're referencing. So in cases like this where you're using a pronoun, you want to make sure both that you have obviously the correct pronoun, or if there's no option that has a clear antecedent, you want to make sure that you're using whatever option is specific. So for example, if there was a name, you'd want to use the name. Or if there was a proper noun, you'd want to use the proper noun. So that's another thing that you should know for the SAT writing section. Hopefully this video was helpful. Today I have an SAT writing tip and trick for you that deals with dangling modifiers. If you don't know what a dangling modifier is, a dangling modifier occurs when you have an introductory modifying clause, such as far from marking the end of investigative journalism, and then obviously we have to follow that with a comma since it's at the beginning of a sentence, and then the subject that it's modifying, which needs to come after this comma, is not the correct subject. So in this case we have the option cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens. Now, if you read this passage, you would understand that the modifier here, it needs to modify the advent of the digital age. So C would have to be our correct answer, and I'll explain why. So in this passage, it talks about how far from marking the end of investigative journalism, the advent of the digital age, which it talks about being the introduction of technology in journalism, has actually increased the number of potential investigators by facilitating cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens. So then if I look at my other options as far as how I can be sure that C is correct, I know that option A, B, and D all have to be incorrect because they would have a dangling modifier. Now a dangling modifier, like I said, that's when what this introductory modifying clause, right, which I put in blue and we'll put circle it in green as well. A dangling modifier is when that introductory modifying clause isn't modifying what it should be. Okay, so we know in this case that far from marking the end of investigative journalism, that is not modifying cooperation among journalists, because we know that cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens, that's not what's far from marking the end of investigative journalism. So that would be a dangling modifier, okay, so that would be incorrect. Now, if we look at option B, the number of potential investigators, okay, once again, far from marking the end of investigative journalism, that's not modifying the number of potential investigators. Now, I know that you obviously haven't read this passage, so this may seem like it's a little bit confusing. What I did here is I read the passage and I know that the advent of the digital age is what is responsible for being far from marking the end of investigative journalism. So it has to modify the advent of the digital age. Anything else that it would be modifying, such as by facilitating cooperation among journalists and ordinary citizens, would be incorrect. It would be a dangling modifier because it's not modifying what it's supposed to modify. Okay, so we know that this modifier up here, this far from marking the end of investigative journalism, has to modify only one thing, and that will be the advent of the digital age, because that is with a subject that it has to modify, and that's what has been talked about throughout this passage. So the correct answer there has to be C. So hopefully that SAT writing tip and trick was helpful. If it was, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Today I have 2 SAT writing tips and tricks for you. One dealing with commas and such as statements, and the other dealing with how to effectively set up examples in the following sentences. So the question that says in 41, which of the following or which choice most effectively sets up the examples in the following sentences, that's a fairly typical question on the SAT writing section. So I'm going to give you my advice on how to approach that as someone who has scored perfectly on the SAT writing section on 2 SATs back to back. And then 42 deals with such as and when to have punctuation around it. So I will also address that in today's video. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start up top here at the beginning of this paragraph. That way you can kind of get an idea of context for how to set up the examples in the sentence, right? So we have well worrisome, the decline of traditional print media, and then this is going to be need not entail. 40, the correct answer there is going to be need. I'm not going to get into that because that's not part of the tips for the day. Then we go on, we have 41. At this point it asks us to set up examples in the following sentences. So in order to know what sentence 41 should be, I have to know what my examples are going to be. So I have to skip down. So I'm not even going to read sentence 41 yet because I don't know what it should say because I have to know these examples first. So if you're asked for which choice is going to effectively set up the examples in the following sentences, go ahead and skip that sentence and go down to those examples and read those first because you're just wasting time if you read 41 because you're probably going to end up changing it. So we have nonprofit enterprises such as Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Now in this case, I'm going to go ahead and answer question 42 because I see it's a simple grammar question, so I want to answer that as I read on. So I see I have nonprofit enterprises, and then I have such as the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project have begun to fill the void created by staff losses at newspapers and magazines. Now in this case, such as here is restrictive, okay? Now if such as were non-restrictive, or non-essential, you would have a comma before it. But in this case, it is restrictive because it's referring to the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Okay, so in this case, it is restrictive because it wouldn't be allowing for more than that one. Okay, so in this case, it is restrictive. Now, when such as is restrictive, you do not want to have a comma before it. You want to have no comma before it, and you're not going to want to have a comma after it. So in this case, the correct answer would just be A. You don't want to change it. Now, if it were restrictive, so say for example, if it were non-restrictive, say for example, you had a full sentence, and then at the end you had a comma, such as, and then just a few examples that you could take out. You could take out such as in those examples and it would still be a complete sentence. Then you would want to have a comma before the word such as. Now in this case, you can't do that. Okay, if you were to take out such as the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, then you would be changing the meaning of the sentence because in this case it is restrictive. Okay, so if it's restrictive, you want to have no punctuation before or after such as, but if it is non-restrictive, you would want to have a comma before such as. So in this case it is restrictive, therefore we want the correct answer of A. Now, we can go ahead and read on and get our examples and then answer 41. Okay, so we have begun to fill the void created by staff losses at newspapers and magazines. Enterprising freelance reporters, newly funded by nonprofits, make extensive use of social media, including blogs and Twitter, to foster a public conversation about key issues. The Help Me Investigate project solicited readers to submit tips and information related to ongoing stories for his website. So I see all of those are going to be examples of how we have investigative journalism coming in new forms, right? We have innovative ways, changes to past times, right? In the past, we know that investigative journalism was largely done through print media. Now we see that this increase in technology in these changing times, right? Recent years have witnessed innovative adjustments to changing times, right? We have new forms of investigative journalisms headed by nonprofits, headed by social media, enterprising freelance reporters. Okay, so our correct answer for 41 then would be D. Now let's go ahead and cover why A, B, and C are all wrong for 41 because it's important to understand why some answers are incorrect. All right, so A, no change. Well, no change says, although many newsrooms have reduced their staff, some still employ investigative reporters. Well, that's not addressing these innovative things and these innovative adjustments that have been made in the marketplace, right? Now we have people using social media. We have nonprofits entering the marketplace now. So it's not just those old print newspapers, and 41 doesn't address that, or A doesn't address that in 41. So A is incorrect. B, investigative journalism also declined between the 1930s and 50s, only to be revived in the 60s. Once again, that's not introducing those innovative examples that follow. Now, option C, according to the Pew Research Center, more people get their national and international news from the internet than from newspapers. Once again, that's not addressing those innovative ways that come to follow, right, that are in the following sentences. Now, does it address it more than A and B? Yes, but at the same time, us saying, according to the Pew Research Center, more people get their national and international news from the internet than from newspapers, that's also not addressing the key part here that is investigative journalism. We want to focus on investigative journalism, and that doesn't say that. That's talking about the news in general. So that would be moving away from the main idea of this passage, right? We want to introduce these examples of innovative adjustments in investigative journalism to these changing times of changing technology. So our correct answer there would be D. Okay, so if you have a question that's asking you to set up the examples in the following sentences, what I recommend doing is not even reading the sentence it's talking about and just skipping down to those examples. Read those examples, figure out what it's talking about, come up with your own answer, then you can go back and find what would set up those examples. If you try to answer it without reading on to see those examples, you're just going to end up getting it wrong because you don't know what you're supposed to set up. So you want to make sure you read those examples first, then go back and answer your question. Right, and I already talked about the such as statement and the rules grammatically for that one. So that takes care of the tips and tricks for the SAT writing section of today's video. As always, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Today I'll be giving you an SAT writing tip and trick that deals with adding or not adding a sentence or keeping or deleting a sentence. So a common question on the SAT writing section is whether or not a sentence should be kept or deleted or added or not added. Now when dealing with this question, it's important to consider context as well as the purpose of including that sentence. So what I want to do here is I want to take you through 3 different questions from SAT Practice Test 5 that deal with keeping or deleting a sentence or adding or not adding a sentence. So those questions are going to be number 3, number 27, and number 38. So as I go through, pay attention to both how I'm getting to my answer, and I'm also going to explain to you why these answers are correct, as well as common things that you can know in order to determine whether or not a sentence should be kept or deleted. So let's take a look at number 3. So the writer is considering deleting the underlined sentence. Should the sentence be kept or deleted? So now in this context of this paragraph, we have a 3D printer then builds a polymer based on this blueprint, much as a regular computer printer reproduces digital documents on paper. Now this passage is talking about 3D printers and x-rays as well. So in this case, we have number 3, right? Our third question. We have, whereas the head of an ordinary computer printer moves back and forth while printing ink onto paper, the corresponding part of a 3D printer moves in multiple dimensions while squirting out thin layers of melted polymer plastic. Okay, so it's describing how a 3D printer works. Then we have the plastic hardens quickly, right? So we just talked about melted polymer plastic, and I see my next sentence talks about plastic hardening quickly, allowing the printer to build the layers of the final model. Okay, so that's more and more expansion on how a 3D printer works. Now, if we were to remove sentence 3, we'd be interrupting and not having the whole story behind how a 3D printer works. We would be removing pretty much, it looks like a third of this description, at least a third, maybe even half of the description of how a 3D printer works. And that's what this discussion from here all the way down is about. It's about how that 3D printer works. So we want to make sure we're keeping this sentence because it's providing details that are illustrating how a 3D printer works, which go along obviously with this sentence after. The plastic hardens quickly. Well, what plastic? Well, that would be that plastic that is melted polymer. Okay, so we can obviously see using context clues we have to keep this, because if we don't, I'm going to put this in green, if we don't keep this sentence, then the part here, the plastic hardens quickly, will not make sense. So we have to keep that sentence. So one thing that you can do when considering whether to add a sentence or not add it, or whether to keep a sentence or delete it, is you can look at context around it. So notice how I looked back a sentence when figuring out how to place this. Now obviously if I was taking the SAT writing section, I would have just read that sentence, so I wouldn't have to go back and reread it. But notice how I use context, right? I see before I'm talking about a 3D printer and how it's working based on a blueprint, and then I see after I'm talking about plastic hardening quickly. Well, I don't talk about that if I were to remove this, so I have to keep it because I have this part here, that melted polymer plastic. So using context clues to decide whether you should keep or delete a sentence is a really, really great strategy for the SAT writing section. So correct answer for 3 will be B, and at this point I'm going to move on to question 27, give you some more advice on how to deal with these types of questions. Okay, so let's go down and take a look at 27. Okay, so 27. Okay, so in this passage we're talking about crowdfunding of the arts. So I see at 27 I'm told that the writer is considering adding the following sentence. The sentence is, crowdfunding tends to attract contributors from a wide variety of professional fields. So I'm going to give you some context for this. In this passage we're talking about how in the arts they're using crowdfunding obviously to raise money. Now the main focus here is about more on the arts and the artists and how they're crowdfunding and how it's impacting the work that they produce. It's not focusing at all on the types of people who are donating, right? The types of people, what professional fields they're from that are donating, right? That are contributing. Okay, so they're not focusing on that. So in this case, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make sure that we do not add this. Okay, we don't want to add it, and why? Well, let's take a look at this paragraph, and it'll give you a little bit more insight into what the passage is about as well that way. So we have artists such as these Brooklyn performers find that crowdfunding exacerbates problems that already exist. Work that is easily understood and appreciated is supported, while more complex work goes unnoticed. Okay, at this point, I'm told that the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Crowdfunding tends to attract contributors from a wide variety of professional fields. Okay, so right there it doesn't make sense already, but in this case, I'm going to read on because I always want to see what that next sentence is, okay? Because that next sentence, if it also doesn't make sense with it, then obviously I can go ahead and make sure that I don't add it. But if something in that next sentence told me I needed to add it, then I would want to add it. So let's go ahead and read on. We have time that could be used creating art is spent devising clever perks to draw the attention of potential contributors. In addition, audiences may contain many free riders who do not make contributions. Okay, in that case, we're not talking about the type of professional field contributors are from, therefore I don't want to add it, right? Both before and after 27, it did not talk about the professional fields being relevant, right, to contributors. So we don't want to add it there. Why? Well, we don't want to add it because it's blurring the focus of the paragraph, okay? And that's a common answer. If there's a sentence that you don't want to add, a lot of times the answer will be because it blurs the focus of the paragraph. So many times you'll see that you'll have something that's really unrelated being told if you want to add it, and if it's unrelated, you do not want to add it because it's going to blur the focus of the paragraph by introducing a poorly integrated piece of information. Okay, so anything that's blurring the focus of your paragraph, you want to make sure that you do not add. Okay, so if anything is not supporting your argument or is just completely off topic, you want to make sure that you do not add it. Okay, so our correct answer for 27 there is going to be D. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and move on to question 38 to give you another example. Okay, and then after 38, I'm also going to touch on a few tips I have regarding these questions as well that weren't addressed in these particular questions. Okay, 38. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Okay, so this is a passage talking about how, I believe that this is the one where we talk about an incident dealing with, let's see, talking about work is inexpensive. Okay, so this one's the investigative journalism passage. So let's talk about investigative journalism. It talks about how a little bit about its history as well as how it's changing now in modern times with technology. So we're talking about question 38 here, so I'll go ahead and give you some context. The exposure by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of government misconduct in the Watergate scandal resulted in the resignation of President Richard Nixon in 1974. More recently, Seymour Hersh, reporting for the New Yorker in 2004, helped publicize the mistreatment of Iraqi prisoners by U.S. personnel at Abu Ghraib during the Iraq War. Okay, now in 38, I asked, should I add the following sentence? Okay, one thing immediately jumps out to me is I see in 1954. Well, I'm going to put this in blue so you can see it. Okay, if I look back at my passage, I see I went from 1974 to 2004. Okay, so I'm moving forward in time. I went from the past and I'm moving more towards the present. Now, if I was to go all the way back to 1954, then I would be messing up this chronological order that I have established. Okay, I don't want to do that. So that's one thing that jumps out to me as a red flag right away. But I'll go ahead and read on to see if I do need to add it for some reason, such as something following it in the next sentence or something like that. We have Edward R. Murrow and Fred Friendly produced episodes of the CBS television show See It Now that contributed to the end of U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunts. In these and other cases, exposure from reporters have served as an important blockade to or scolding of malfeasance. And I'm pretty sure that you have to change 39, right? 90% sure, but it's not dealing with the tip and trick from today's video, so I'm not going to deal with that question right now. But what I see is I see in the sentence after and in the sentence preceding it, there's no need for that sentence, right? So not only is there no need for it, but it is not chronologically correct, okay? So if it were chronologically correct, then one argument you could make, and this probably wouldn't be, if it was chronologically correct, they wouldn't ask this question because it would really just be something where you could just add another piece of evidence if you wanted to, so it wouldn't necessarily have a clear indication, in my opinion. If it was chronologically correct, my guess, they just wouldn't ask this question if it was, I don't think. But in this case, obviously, we see that it's not chronologically correct because we move from a advancement in time, then we'd be going all the way back to before 1974. So we're not going to add it because it's not chronologically correct, right? So we can go ahead and get rid of A and B. Now we're looking at C and D. We see C says no because it gives an example that's chronologically and substantively out of place in the paragraph, right? So when we're talking about investigative journalism, we were really focusing mostly on print journalism as well, and this switches over to television journalism. So that's another reason why this would not be a good fit as well, okay? Because this, you can't necessarily tell because I didn't read the whole passage, but it was largely about how print investigative journalism is kind of going out of style in this advancement of technology, and we're now innovating. So switching over to television would also not be a great move there. Okay, so our answer there would be C. As far as D, no, because it provides an example that's inconsistent with the passage's definition of investigative journalism. The passage, I don't believe it defined investigative journalism, but even if it did, I'm pretty sure it did include television. It just didn't focus on that throughout it. So D would also be incorrect, right? It's given an example that's chronologically and substantively out of place in the paragraph. That's going to be our correct answer for 38. Okay, now one thing I do want to touch on is I just want to touch on a couple of reasons that are typical as far as when to make an addition and when not to make an addition. So I'm going to go ahead and just move over to the right of my screen, and I'll maybe make a little T-chart, and I'll talk about things on both sides of it real quick. So when to add or keep. So I'll put add or keep on this side, Okay, so these are going to be cases where you want to make sure you add that sentence or keep a sentence there. Okay, and then on my other side, I will have not add / delete. Okay, so I'm just going to list a couple reasons. I'm probably not going to write them all out because that would take a long time, but I'll maybe just give a key indicator, right? So when are you going to want to add or keep a question or keep a sentence? Well, if that sentence has context that is necessary to other sentences in the passage, you want to keep it. Okay, so if it's necessary context, you need to keep it. Necessary context. So you need to have this sentence in order for the rest of the paragraph to make sense. Now another thing would be if it supports a claim. Okay, if it's something that supports a claim and provides evidence, then you're going to want to keep it in. Okay, so those are really two big things there, right? So you saw in that example of the 3D printer that we needed it to have that context in order for that next sentence to make sense. We also know that if we want to keep a sentence and we want to add if it's supporting a claim in our paragraph that hasn't been supported yet. Okay, so those are two big things as far as when to add and keep a sentence. Now, what about when not to add or when to delete? Okay, number one thing here is if it's off topic. Okay, if it's off topic and it blurs the focus, right? I'll put under that. They usually say blurs focus when you're not supposed to add it or delete. Or if it blurs the focus of a paragraph, you're going to want to make sure you don't add it or you delete it. Okay, another thing is if it is unsupported. Okay, if it's something that's unsupported, for example, let's say that it's a claim that doesn't go on to get supported, and generally if a claim is unsupported like that and you're supposed to not add it or delete it, generally it'll be off topic as well. So I'm actually going to put an arrow up here because generally it'll be off topic as well. So a claim that's unsupported or something like that, but it'll usually be off topic as well. So that kind of loops back there. Another thing would just be obviously if it's out of order, like you saw in that chronological part, that question 38 I just talked about. If it's out of order, you're not going to want to add it. You're going to want to make sure you delete it. So those are really, I'd say, the main things there that I wanted to touch on. So hopefully this video was helpful. If it